All right, Gwen, it looks like we're getting pretty settled in here. If you want to go ahead and start with our technical overview. Again, today's webinar is Collaborative Recovery and Conservation of Threatened and Endangered Species. Are we still being successful? Our panelists are Phil Huber, formerly of the U.S. Forest Service, very recently retired, Steve Roels of the American Bird Conservancy, Scott Hicks from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Erin Victory from the Michigan DNR. Today's focus will be on discussing Kirtland's warbler and the recovery, delisting, and ongoing conservation of Kirtland's warbler and conservation-reliant species. Gwen, do you want to take us away?
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first edition of our new webinar series. We have a wonderful panel for you today, and welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We are coming to you from our wonderful and snowy Shepherdstown, West Virginia, here at NCTC. My name is Gwyneth Daunton, and today's webinar will be titled Collaborative Recovery and Conservation for Threatened and Endangered Species. Are we still being successful? We are excited to have Phil Huber, Steve Roels, Scott Hicks, and Erin Victory here today. We will be introducing them in a moment, but we would first like to remind you of some pre-webinar items. So here at the National Conservation Training Center, we have a land acknowledgement, and we would like to start with this webinar series. So we understand that we are located on ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples, including but not limited to the Massawomac, Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. And NCTC is dedicated to building these relationships with indigenous communities, and we encourage others to learn about the land that you live and work on. And so if you are interested in learning more about that, please send me a chat and I can send you more information about how you can figure out that information. We also would like to mention that NCTC welcomes all students. We believe in diverse ideas come from diverse people, and we want to create a safe and inclusive learning environment for you guys to be in. And so if any time you feel uncomfortable during this webinar series, please send a chat to just the panelists and I can help you, or just directly to me and I can help you to the best of my ability. We welcome everyone and we hope everyone feels safe here. Just a disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenters and are not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright, and so they may have to be licensed to us by third parties and are restricted in their use. Mentions of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, and other references does not imply federal endorsement. Last but not least, as Lindsay mentioned, please introduce yourself in the chat. We are on air, and so everything here is being recorded, and we will be asking for questions at the end. And so if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat and we'll come back to you. I think Haven is our moderator today, and so he will be looking through questions at the end. And so feel free to introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't already. Also, the best way to view this panel is through gallery. And so if you go up to view, there should be the little dots in the square. And if you go down to gallery, you can see all of our wonderful panelists today and also our wonderful ASL interpreter who's doing a great job up there. Unless, Lindsay, your turn. You're muted, Lindsay.
Sorry, I don't do a lot of Zoom. I'm still getting used to it. We'll get better. First, I'd like to start out by thanking U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Ecology Working Group, Science Applications, and Migratory Birds Programs, and the National Conservation Training Center, as well as the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Sciences, and the USDA Forest Service in sponsoring these webinar series. If you have questions or commentary, please feel free to contact myself or Amanda Mahaffey. Our information is listed below. We will have a rotating series of hosts throughout this webinar series. So each webinar will have a different host, but we'll be back and forth. That will be myself, Amanda Mahaffey, Haven Barnhill, and Jeff Horan, formerly of Fish and Wildlife Service, also recently retired. Any issues you need for technical issues or registration, please contact Gwyneth Doughton. And just a reminder that continuing education credits are available from the Wildlife Society and Society of American Foresters. And if you need assistance with that, please contact Gwyneth Doughton or Jim Siegel for more information on those credits. So, a little background because this is the first webinar of the series. This is a 12-part monthly webinar series on the third Tuesday of every month that will feature interactive panel discussions exploring the impact of climate shifts on forest habitat and adaptation options for natural resources management. Panels will represent a diversity of scientists and natural resource managers and will provide examples of silviculture, restoration, and collaborative conservation stories. We will kind of open with, again, our standard introductions of our panelists. Then there will be about 40 minutes for a moderated discussion, followed by 15 to 20 minutes for open Q&A. The next webinar in our series is going to focus on reforestation and regeneration for wildlife and sustaining forests in those changing environmental conditions. The goal of the panel is to, sorry, I'm having something jump at me, is to really look at, examples of ecological silviculture, restoration techniques, things that enhance habitat, along with the planning, policy, and guidance and partnerships that are needed to get those actions implemented. So it's not just about the habitat and the biology of it, but we're also going to be focusing a lot on the collaboration, the partnerships, how do we actually make it happen, sometimes even from a bureaucratic side, but a lot from the implementation side as well. Gwyneth, we go ahead and go to the next one, please. Our speakers today are Phil Huber, again, a wildlife biologist from the U.S. Forest Service, very recently retired. Steve Roels, the Kirtland's Warbler Program Director and Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team Coordinator with American Bird Conservancy. Scott Hicks, the Field Supervisor with the Michigan Ecological Services Field Office with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And Erin Victory, the Wildlife Ecologist Planner with the Michigan DNR. I am Lindsay Grayson, a forest ecologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Midwest region, and I will be moderating today's discussion. I would like to really quick here remind everyone again, we are doing a Q&A at the end, and that please put your questions in as you think of them. Haven Barnhill will be monitoring the chat, and he will be collating the questions and grouping them into themes for our panelists. So as you think of them, please put them in. It doesn't just have to be at the end. I would like to remind people, there's an elephant in the room. We have a brand new administration. Just want to remind folks that that administration is less than 24 hours old. So if you could please refrain from asking specific questions on the new administration's priorities or policies, because at this point, we pretty much know what you do, which is to say not enough to answer those questions. So if we could try and keep them, pretty tight to Kirtland's Warbler or collaborative conservation or any of those sorts of efforts, please try to do that because we just don't have answers either right now. It is brand new. So, Gwen, if you would go ahead and move us to the next slide. I'm going to start us off with a real brief sort of description on Kirtland's Warbler biology, just so that everyone has enough background to understand a lot of the discussion. And then Phil will get us going with more background on the recovery work of Kirtland's Warbler. So Kirtland's Warbler were one of the first species listed as endangered. They were actually listed under the 1966 Endangered Species Protection Act, even before our current Endangered Species Act. They are a habitat specialist that breeds only in young, very dense jack pine. So they're a ground nesting bird. They do need that very low, dense branching to stay safe and for their breeding habitat. As you can see in the bottom left here, that is an image of the range of jack pine forest in the United States. So they stay in the United States from about May until the fall for breeding, and then they will fly south predominantly in the Bahamas, but I believe also in a couple of other Caribbean islands for their wintering range. They they were listed very early on, and then were in a recovery for 40, 50, 60 years. They were delisted in 2019, and we are now in what we will call the post delisting era. Just so you are aware, I think a lot of folks will probably use the shorthand KW for Kirtland's Warbler and KWCT for the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team. Just want to get those out ahead of time. Phil, I'm sorry. So that's a little bit of background biology and understanding of Kirtland's Warbler. I do want to give our panelists some time to introduce themselves and talk a little about themselves. So, Phil, if you wanted to start us off with a little bit about yourself, and if you could share with us what's the most surprising thing that you've learned about Kirtland's Warbler or collaborative conservation in your role conserving Kirtland's Warbler?
Thanks, Lindsay. My name's Phil Huber. I'm a wildlife biologist, recently retired from the U.S. Forest Service. I worked on Kirtland Warbler recovery my entire career. I had a bachelor's degree in forestry and ended up working in wildlife my entire career. So what's really cool about that is my forestry degree came in really handy because we manage lots of forest habitat for the Kirtland's Warbler, and it was my passion for 40 plus years. And I'm always learning new things about Kirtland's Warblers, and never surprised by what we see when we do the census. So where you expect birds to appear, they aren't, and where you don't expect them to appear, they are. So continually learning.
Always love when that happens.
Yes.
Scott, would you mind going next?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Scott Hicks. I'm the field supervisor for the Fish and Wildlife Services Ecological Services Program here in Michigan. And I've been in this role since 2011. And so I've had the chance to be involved in kind of some of the transitional periods of the Kirtland's Warbler recovery and into delisting. I would say probably one of the things that I found most surprising about Kirtland's Warbler and the whole recovery effort is just the importance of the individuals have made in terms of like the recovery team, the conservation team. It's just been a very special thing to see and be part of is the family feel that the recovery team has. So I think there's something very unique about the bird and the recovery effort. So it's been kind of cool to see that and the role that that's played.
Thank you. Steve?
Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Roels. I'm the Kirtland's Warbler Program Director for American Bird Conservancy, and I also serve in another role as the coordinator of the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team. So for me, having these two different hats that I wear is interesting because I can think about the conservation of Kirtland's Warbler and the recovery effort from the perspective of an individual organization, but then also from the perspective of the whole collaboration and thinking about what the many different organizations involved need in order to collaborate and work together. Following up on what Scott said, that has probably been my biggest surprise joining the conservation effort for Kirtland's Warbler is the importance of the personal relationships that have been built over many years or even multiple decades between some of the people that have been involved in this work. There's something about it that seems to capture people's attention and imagination and keeps them engaged over the long haul, whether it's someone like Phil, who spent over 4 decades with the Forest Service, or even some of our Bahamian colleagues who have been involved in Kirtland's Warbler work now for almost 25 years.
Thank you. And Erin?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Erin Victory. I am the ecologist planner for the Northern Lower Peninsula in Michigan for the Wildlife Division of Michigan's DNR. I have been involved in the DNR's KW management program for about the last decade, but it's just been in the last year that I became the KW lead for the DNR. And as far as, kind of what's unique about this is kind of piggyback on what Scott and Steve said in terms of the resources and the expertise available in the KW conservation team is sort of extraordinary, right? It's just it's definitely a team effort, a collaborative effort, which I'm sure we'll be getting more into during this discussion. But it's just great to, as we try to tackle problems and, talk about issues, there's just such a wealth of knowledge in this group that I've just found that to be a huge benefit.
Thanks, Erin. And I am Lindsay Grayson. I'm a forest ecologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I am also relatively new to the Kirtland warbler conservation team. And I would say that I have been surprised, sort of on the same level you guys are, but a little bit different twist of how willing people are to change the way they're thinking and to change what they're doing to meet a new challenge or a new issue. That's been really exciting to see, and I think very unusual in these cross-agency inter-program collaborations. Okay. Sorry, if we could go ahead and get started then on our discussion portion. Phil, if you would kick us off a little bit about kind of where the recovery team started, kind of the setup and how we realized there was a problem, who cares about Kirtland's warbler and why? And Scott and Steve, if there's some time to interject about a little bit of the bureaucracy, how it works, sort of legal responsibility, anything there that might give folks a little bit more understanding of the how the process happens too.
Thanks, Lindsay. So any of the other panelists, feel free to interject anything I might have missed in my discussion here. So in the early 1970s, there was a decadal census done for the Kirtlands and found that there were only 200 pairs. And as a result, the Kirtlands was listed as endangered species, one of the first species listed as endangered in 1973. And what's a little bit different about the Kirtlands is that the 1973 recovery team, they wrote the recovery plan, but they decided to stay together and continue to meet even after the recovery plan was written. And so that's what I think is unique about this group. It's been in existence for more than, well, probably 5 decades now. And so the approach for this species was not to just write a recovery plan and that was it. It was to write a recovery plan and then see the recovery through. So at that time in the 1970s, there were a lot of unknowns at the time. And there were managers, researchers from different agencies, and they recognized the need to work together to answer those questions. And so basically, there was a combination. It was thought at the time that breeding habitat was a limiting factor as well as cowbird parasitism. So they recognized the need to have the right people at the table. And it wasn't just wildlife biologists, it was foresters as well, researchers and other folks that could contribute from many different agencies to help on the recovery of this species. So like I said, there was only 200 breeding pairs at the time, and the recovery plan set a goal of 1,000 pairs. Shortly after, 6 years or 7 years after the recovery plan was written, the Forest Service was doing a prescribed burn for the Kirtland's warbler to reduce slash. So the technique at the time was to clear cut 300 or more acres of jack pine. At that time, those areas were short wooded, which means all the tops of the trees were left on site. those tops were needed to be removed so that they could get planting machines in to plant trees for the species. And at that point in time, the Weather Service was, we didn't have Doppler radar. We didn't have a lot of the modern technology that we have these days to predict weather. And some high winds came up on that day, and basically that prescribed burn for the Kirtland's warbler escaped and burned 25,000 acres. Several homes and private property were burned, and the biggest loss was a loss of a Forest Service wildlife biologist's life when he was helping to suppress that fire. So there we are. We burned up. We're trying to do conservation for the species, this newly listed species, and we end up burning up 25,000 acres. And at that time, there was a lot of animosity toward the Kirtland's warbler program and the Forest Service. And so that made life even more difficult when we didn't have community support. So in 1981, the year after the fire, the first Kirtland warbler forest management plan was written to attempt to establish breeding habitat for the species. And what that did is it established 24 management areas on federal and state lands. And at the time, they thought it would be best to spread out that habitat amongst those 24 management areas. So each of those management areas was split into smaller subunits, and then each subunit was split into 5 blocks, which the thought was we'll cut 250 acres of each of those blocks every 10 years. And I'll tell you later why that really didn't work out so well. Shortly thereafter, in 1986, parts of the Mac Lake burn became occupied by Kirtland's warbler. And so this large expanse of regenerating jack pine was proving to be habitat for the species. And what we found, and Lindsay, I don't know if you can bring up that graph that we talked about earlier, but our peak occupancy was during the early to mid 1990s when the habitat was about 10 to 12 years old. And so the population of the Kirtland's warbler began to increase substantially, and largely as a result of the wildfire and not so much our plantation habitat actions. And what was interesting about the wildfire was that we quickly learned that large burn areas had higher densities of birds than our plantations, and that by the 2000s we saw that the duration of occupancy was longer in those larger areas of habitat than in our plantations. And so I think the managers of the land quickly realized that our 250 acre blocks, scattered blocks, were really fragmenting the habitat, and we weren't getting the kind of results that we were getting in a burn area. And so then in 2001, we revised the management plan for the first time, and we increased the block size to 550 acres. And at this point, you can see on this graph, in about 2001 or 2000, we exceeded our 1,000 pair recovery objective for the first time. And at that time, a lot of our plantation habitat was coming into occupancy as well. So things were looking really good. And so this was a classic example of adaptive management in its making. And so you have to realize that the recovery team was meeting twice a year throughout this period, talking about a lot of different issues related to habitat management. and how the birds were using those habitats. And so what was really cool was that this was decades of the recovery team working together on to solving problems. And so as Scott mentioned before, this is a unique collaboration, and not only collaboration, but there was a lot of trust between folks in different agencies. And when you work that long together to solve a problem, you build friendships, decades longs of friendships. And so if you think about the people who started this recovery team in the 70s, many of them have passed away, if not all of them. And all of this knowledge keeps getting passed down from generation to generation, and we just build upon each other's experiences. So that's where we are today with the Kirtland warbler conservation team. And once we exceeded the 1,000 pairs in around 2001, that's when we started talking about the potential for delisting. But that then took another 10 years of processing and figuring out how we were going to do this. So I'll turn it back to you, Lindsay.
Thank you very much, Phil. So, what I heard a lot is that you had a lot of change in that recovery plan. So if the recovery plan was built and then everyone stayed together to keep working on it, can you describe some of the changes that happened in the recovery plan over time? Like how did those changes get approved or sort of implemented, as it were?
Yeah, I don't. So the recovery plan itself, I believe it was revised one time
Okay.
in 1985, and they were fairly minor revisions. But I think what a lot of the changes were in how we developed the habitat, and also you can't forget the cowbird control. So one thing I don't think anybody's mentioned prior to this is that the reason we decided that we needed to harvest and plant jack pine is because of fire suppression. So fire suppression was leading to the loss of habitat for the Kirtland's warbler, and there was no way that agencies could allow wildfires to burn in this fairly heavily populated environment in northern lower peninsula of Michigan. And so in lieu of allowing fires to burn, the thought was to harvest and plant jack pine. And so, like I said, we started with a number of scattered blocks all over the place, small scattered blocks that had just a handful of birds. The population wasn't increasing like we thought it should. And then the Mac Lake fire kind of happened, and then we found that we needed to shift our strategy to larger blocks, and so there are a lot of conversation and discussion went on about that, and a lot of issues even internally within each of the agencies related to changing of paradigms. Can the Forest Service even do a 550-acre clear cut? Yes, we can. But that took a lot of selling over time.
And for folks, the image on the screen is what we now call the opposing wave pattern, and sort of shows you there's that handy rectangle is actually an old prescribed burn surrounded by opposing wave, which is how we traditionally manage Kirtland warbler habitat now on these very large blocks. So that it is cleared, mostly cleared. We are sort of getting into leaving a little bit more, and then replanted in this pattern to leave the openings that they need, and also that very dense thicket habitat that would naturally have come from prescribed fire.
Yeah, this whole program is a huge commitment of time and money. Jack pine has very low value, and so we needed to find creative ways along the way to figure out how to pay for this habitat development. And planting jack pine at a very dense planting pattern is not really conducive to growing quality trees either. So we're kind of setting ourselves up for a mess, really, when it comes to timber harvest.
Yeah, and I think that is a good segue, Phil, for us to maybe we were kind of originally going to talk about maybe delisting, downlisting, but I think this veers us into a different portion instead, and we'll just head, kind of into how we are arranged and how people deal with a lot of these issues. So, after that extensive recovery work, the decision was made to delist Kirtland's warbler in 2019. And we still have the same problems, though. The same issues are still there with the habitat and with that high density jack pine not being very merchantable, very economical. And so maybe we can move into sort of a discussion on those issues and how the Kirtland Warbler Conservation Team has worked together for market issues, and how maybe, Erin, if you want to talk some about the DNR and how does the DNR deal with this from an economic standpoint and a policy standpoint? How do you deal with the expensive, frankly, nature of Kirtland's warbler management at that sort of scale?
Yeah, so one thing before I sort of dive in, one thing I also kind of want to point out, and this has sort of been alluded to, but just to kind of explicitly state that because right, this jack pine ecosystem was historically maintained through fire, right? It's a fire adapted species. It's got serotinous cones, right? And so historically speaking, it was these wildfires that would sort of restart young jack pine in, with sort of that low branching structure that Kirtland's warbler require, right? But then, as Phil mentioned, due to fire suppression activities in the late 18 and primarily the 1900s, right? The habitat started maturing, and that's when the significant losses start. So again, sort of in lieu of fire management, we have to find a way to continue to maintain young forest, young jack pine forest on the ground, and so that can be very expensive, as Phil mentioned. And so and also because you saw that we also call it the KW weave, or the opposing wave pattern. When trees are planted more densely, it takes longer for them to kind of, add diameter, right? So we have been sort of taking a step back. Sorry, this is the other point I was trying to make. So with delisting, right, prior to delisting, we did get some federal funding, right? Because it was a listed species. With delisting, we lost that federal funding. However, we have all acknowledged that because of fire suppression and because they require young jack pine, this is going to be a conservation reliant species, right? We can never not intensively manage for this species, right? This is going to be an indefinite thing, like commitment, right? So, so we've had to sort of take a step back as a community, and also, within the DNR, to kind of figure out where we're at with the ability to continue to manage the species moving forward. And, jack pine is also a pioneer species. It's early successional, and so it responds really well, unsurprisingly, right, to clear cut management. And so there is a market for jack pine trees once they get to adequate enough diameters. So that means, as part of our taking a step back and looking at our management, we've actually bumped out our rotation age for jack pine. It was historically, we had said it was 50 years, but primarily it was getting clear cut in the 40-year age class more often than not. And so we've bumped that rotation age out to a minimum of 60 years. So because that's at the point where we think the diameters will be large enough to make it be more marketable, and then we can actually sell the timber, right? We can manage through clear cutting, and loggers will then pay to do that work, so that we're not having to do that. And then our typical approach to management is then we go through and we do a jack pine regeneration survey the first year. Sorry, I should step back. So we do the clear cutting treatment. Historically, we always did then plant jack pine in that opposing wave. Part of our stepping back and reevaluating our management and this cost is trying to shift over into promoting some more natural regeneration. So we are doing regeneration surveys to see how that natural regeneration is coming back. We are also, we do regeneration surveys for our jack pine at years 1 and 3. And then whether it's artificially planted jack pine or if it's natural regeneration jack pine, if it hasn't reached a minimum trees per acre, then we will do supplemental planting to ensure that across the site we have a target trees per acre for jack pine that we've been able to associate with certain KW densities and KW breeding success. We are also taking a look because this whole KW weave thing, as Phil can probably explain more, was just sort of something they just tried at one point, right? Like nobody ever kind of thought about at what density that should be and, you know, what were the optimal densities. They just sort of tried something and it worked, and we've just been doing it ever since. And so we are doing some trials of planting at different densities because it's more expensive, right? The more trees you plant, the more expensive it is. So planting at higher densities is more costly. If we can bump that down, but still have good breeding response, you know, equitable breeding response, that's something that we're looking into as well. Another thing that we've tried here in the DNR is interplanting red pine. That is a very high dollar value tree species here in Michigan. And so if we can interplant it, maybe we can bump up the revenue in those sales or at least make it more marketable for loggers. So those are kind of some of the approaches that we're trying to explore as we move forward. The other sort of caveat here is because we historically were clear cutting more in the like 40-year age class, and it's not really marketable at these densities until around 60. You know, we just sort of recently sort of revised that. We have a little bit of an age class distribution issue. And so we sort of have a peak around the age 30 and 40-year age classes in our jack pine landscape. And so we are also trying some alternative methods to regenerate jack pine, including mastication and in the 20-year age class, which is basically just mowing down trees. And then we're also trying to see if there's any biomass markets in the 30-year age class so that we can still kind of sell that timber and help with cost reduction in that way, but still create that habitat. So a lot of aspects to it that we're trying to, you know, just sort of figure out as we go to address some of those cost issues, but also still maintain our annual habitat creation targets to maintain our bird numbers.
Yeah, so Erin, thank you for all that information. You bring up a really good point, which is things are changing and there's a lot of hiccups and some new hiccups. And Scott, we had discussed this before, and maybe if you would kind of tell us a little bit more about sort of why a lot of these weren't ironed out pre-delisting and how delisting happened, and sort of what processes are in place to help us figure it out as we go along, and why we went ahead and did delist even though we didn't have everything figured out, although I'm not sure any of us ever really do, even if we want to believe we do. And then Steve too, you know, maybe we could kind of get into a discussion right after that about the conservation team and how the conservation team is working together to solve these issues, especially in this post-delisting era, where, as Erin said, there's not necessarily the federal funding, there's not all the regulation that is forcing everyone to be a part of it.
Yeah, well, Lindsay, I'm happy to jump in here. I think from my perspective, I think maybe a good place to start is to first acknowledge that there were some real visionaries that when Phil mentioned that we had reached the point where the population was hitting its recovery targets, but there were questions about, okay, how do you address a delisted world where some of the financial support for like forest management, like Erin mentioned, was going to go away with delisting. The cowbird control that had been really critical to reaching recovery, the funding for that was tied to the Endangered Species Act. So I think it's important to acknowledge that as part of the recovery team and the efforts around it, there was a lot of thinking about like how do you create a future for a species without these key mechanisms of support that were provided by the Endangered Species Act. So just a big shout out to Carol Bassetti, the former recovery team leader, Kirtland's warbler conservation team leader. She played an instrumental role in kind of envisioning this future. Craig Zarnecki at the Fish and Wildlife Service played a key role. Christy Deloria at Fish and Wildlife Service, just lots and lots of individuals played a really important role in trying to envision what the future could look like. And they envisioned having something to replace the recovery plan. They came up with an updated breeding range conservation plan led by the Michigan DNR, Dan Kennedy there. And that incorporated things that we acknowledged that we knew we were going to have to adaptively manage forestry, right? We understood that the challenges with marketing Jack Pine products and things like that. They envisioned the conservation team replacing the recovery team. And then they envisioned ways of trying to provide funding for cowbird control and habitat management. And that, I think that one of the important lessons from all this is that, they envisioned a future, and some parts of that have worked out as they envisioned, and other parts didn't work out exactly as envisioned, but they evolved in different ways. And I will say that when it comes to like providing for the funding needs of the species, Steve can talk about the role of the American Bird Conservancy. They've played an important role. Michigan DNR has played an important role. Fish and Wildlife Services helped provide some financial stability into the future through some mitigation funding. So there's a lot of pieces that came together. It wasn't exactly as maybe initially envisioned. It evolved. And I think the reason we felt confident moving forward with delisting was the fact that you had this long history, 40, 50 plus years of a collaboration of problem solving, learning, adaptive management. So for me, I would say that, you need a track record. You need to have something to build on to secure the future. And that's what we had for Kirtland. I would say, some of the things that maybe lessons learned from the first 5 years of delisting, I would say things like, delisting, things can and do change, right? They should change. And I think some of the things that we've learned over time is the importance of feedback loops and making sure that information sharing is really happening like you need it to. And the right hand knows what the left hand is doing, because this is a hugely collaborative effort where the Forest Service is managing a lot of habitat, DNR is managing a lot of habitat, Fish and Wildlife Service, the refuge program owns lands in there interspersed. I mean, it's a very complex process over a very large landscape. And so it's really important to understand, what are the feedback loops? How, there's a great quote from General Mattis about what do I know, who needs to know, and have I told them? And when I look back at our first 5 years of delisting, I think things are going fine, but where I could see where maybe things could be better or could have been better are making sure that we've got information flowing where it needs to, so that, there aren't surprises, that people who need to support decisions are there and they have the information to do so. And then the last thing I'll just throw out in terms of maybe lessons learned from the first 5 years of delisting is really in the importance of making sure that within your own organization that roles are really explicitly clear. I mean, the delisting of Kirtland's warbler involved, as far as I can tell, every program within Fish and Wildlife Service, whether it's grant programs or funded by the fisheries, were managed by our fisheries program, the migratory bird program, played a key role, refuges, ecological services, science applications. I mean, just so many different pieces were coming together and playing important roles. And just delisting is a big change, and you need to really be explicit about, who's got the ball, who's doing what. And I think that's been an important lesson.
And we are lucky enough in Kirtland's Warbler to have the Kirtland's Warbler, not lucky enough, planned ahead enough to have the conservation team. Steve, if you would talk a little bit about that conservation team and how it was prepared to take that challenge up and what has happened in those 5 years post-delisting to keep everything moving in the right direction.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks for putting up this slide. So this slide shows some of the core members, but not every member of the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team. And the conservation team is the evolution of the recovery team. So it was called the recovery team when the species was listed, but post-delisting, it evolved into the conservation team. And so we see the key agencies like the Forest Service and different units within the Forest Service where there's Kirtland's Warbler habitat, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Michigan DNR. Those were core historical members of the conservation team. But then there's been other entities in different categories like nonprofits focused on environmental work, and then also academics that have been very important in creating that adaptive management feedback cycle of getting new scientific information, new insights into the biology of the bird, and making sure that we have this communication that's got emphasized as so important, translating that science into on-the-ground management. And so that's why we have such a broad representation within the conservation team network. And one thing that has happened in more recent years with the team has been the addition of new partners. And that has happened for a couple of different reasons. First, as the recovery has continued and there's been more birds in the population's range has actually expanded. So Kirtland's warblers started appearing outside of that core area in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan in places like the upper peninsula of Michigan, in Wisconsin, and also in Ontario. And so as that happened, representatives from those new geographies, which probably that is the historic range of Kirtland's warbler that was lost and is now being recovered, those organizations were brought into the conservation team network. So that's representatives like the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and then also the Nature Conservancy in Wisconsin. And we have colleagues in Ontario as well, working on restoration of habitat there. But beyond just focusing on the breeding range that we've talked quite a bit about, one thing that was really important to the recovery team and now the conservation team was the inclusion of representatives from the wintering grounds in the Bahamas, and ensuring that not only are we paying attention to the full annual cycle of Kirtland's warbler, knowing that if things go poorly on the wintering grounds, that absolutely affects our success in terms of producing birds on the breeding grounds, but then also making sure that these organizations and the individuals representing them in the Bahamas really are full partners in the conservation team network, and ensuring that they have the capacity that they need to do the science, the conservation science, and also the management for Kirtland's warbler on the wintering grounds. And so there was actually a program started about 25 years ago that trained young Bahamians in ornithological techniques focused on research for Kirtland's warbler. And some of those Bahamians from now over 20 years ago are still members of the conservation team, or went off, got graduate degrees in environmental sciences and natural resources, and now are in positions of influence in the Bahamas, in places like the University of the Bahamas, or the federal government, or the Bahamas National Trust, which is functionally like the National Park Service of the Bahamas. And so that investment in training colleagues on the wintering grounds has really paid off tremendously in terms of the conservation work for Kirtland's warbler, and also the stability and the full scope of the conservation team that we still see today. So that's been really exciting to see that, as I said, those relationships, those personal relationships between individuals continue to pay off many years later. So My role as coordinator of the conservation team is to ensure that we have good communication between all of these different organizations. If we could switch over to the organizational chart quickly. I can talk a little bit about what these units are and how they relate to each other. So don't be alarmed by all the bubbles and arrows here. This is a schematic that shows the structure of the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team. The key components here is that we have a steering committee that includes representatives from many different organizations. So we ensure that diverse perspectives are heard and that everyone feels they've got a seat at the table. And the steering committee makes decisions on behalf of the whole conservation team when it comes to changes to the conservation plans or anything having to do with shared pools of funding. But then we also have other units of the conservation team that are broken down by particular thematic areas. For example, folks that are focused on managing breeding range habitat. And so they have their own subcommittee. We also have a non-breeding range subcommittee that includes people in the Bahamas and also researchers that work in the Bahamas. Critically, we have a human dimension subcommittee, which is something that was in the early years of the recovery effort somewhat ignored, recognizing that the relationships, the public relationships, and also the complex things like market dynamics, the intersection of conservation and other societal systems and networks is really important. And that was missing a little bit until after the Mac Lake fire that Phil mentioned. And it was really coming out of the aftermath of that fire and an era of really poor relationships between the public land management agencies and the communities where Kirtland's Warbler is present, that there was this recognition that we have to invest more time and attention and resources into the human dimension side of this to ensure that this is a sustainable conservation effort. We also have various working groups that work on particular issues, but ultimately it's this whole ecosystem of different units within the conservation team that work together. They have regular meeting schedules and people get to know each other really well and communicate between the different groups. And we also have semi-annual meetings that bring all of these different units together to report out to the whole group and talk about the work they're doing, which ensures that we have this kind of communication that Scott indicated is so very important.
Thanks so much for that, Steve. The conservation team, it looks a little bit spooky, but it really does seem to work. You are the conservation team steering committee chair, and you are also the Kirtland's program director for American Bird Conservancy. Can you talk just a small bit about how that position came to be and about its sort of role having that defined single person, or not just single person, but a defined person whose sole role is Kirtland's Warbler and Kirtland's Warbler recovery?
Sure. So just quick clarification, I am the coordinator. Phil is actually currently the chair of the
You think I know
steering
this?
committee. Yeah, we've got a lot of terminology that we throw around. So the coordinator position is often something that folks are very interested in because for a network like this, the vast majority of the people that are included in the network representing their organizations, they have many different duties. Someone like Erin or Phil, yes, they spend a lot of time thinking about Kirtland's Warbler, but they have to think about all the other species within the landscapes that they manage. And so it's really helpful to have that one person who just focuses very tightly on the species of concern, like Kirtland's Warbler, versus just getting 5% of someone's brain space. And so there was a recognition amongst the conservation team, well, we really need to have a coordinator, someone that focuses on facilitating the communication between all of the different individuals and units, and also works to make sure that we have good record keeping, for example, having good meeting minutes. So, 4 years or 4 months down the road, if we're trying to recall some decisions that we made at an earlier meeting, we can reference that and, keep this communication rolling, moving forward and being fairly efficient. So the coordinator role was originally a volunteer position that was a staff member at a local nonprofit that is right in the Kirtland's Warbler core geography, and then moved from being a volunteer position to a part-time paid position. And everyone thought, okay, we really need more hours. We need a stronger, more dedicated person to this effort. And then from a part-time position evolved into a full-time position when I joined the conservation team 2.5 years ago. And so my position is funded through a variety of different funding sources. The position is supported by funding from multiple public agencies. It's also supported by private foundation grants that are held by American Bird Conservancy. And then one thing that American Bird Conservancy has been doing in recent years has been building up a Kirtland's Warbler specific endowment style fund called the Long-Term Fund. And that fund is intended to support all of this ongoing conservation work that we know we can't walk away from. And that will ensure that we have support for the coordinator position as well as a number of other priorities moving forward. And so there's the American Bird Conservancy Fund, and then there's also a separate long-term investment fund that is held by the Michigan DNR, which is intended for cowbird work if it is needed, which currently it appears it is not. So whether that fund then broadens out to be potentially available to support other aspects of the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Program is something that could be reconsidered in the future. But having that long-term vision that Scott referenced, having those visionaries in the group to think about, okay, 20 years from now, where do we want to be? Do we want to be reliant on annual budgets, knowing that we're dealing with a species that has indefinite need, but is no longer tied to Endangered Species Act funding? We need to come up with some more sustainable models for doing things, both financially, but then also in terms of stewarding the network and maintaining all of that communication and having a strong partnership. And the coordinator role is a really important part of that.
So, Steve, you bring up a good point about this long-term planning and sort of the fail-safes that have been built in. So there's not need for cowbird funding now, but that's set aside for if or when that is needed again. There's a threshold on the Kirtland's Warbler recovery plan or conservation plan for how many pairs there are versus, when do we start looking at the plan again and when do we get concerned? Phil brought that up earlier. Could you all discuss some things that you think are needed to keep this going long term? What are some things that are need to change either in the current system, or what do we need to maybe add or remove? That could be something that's, bureaucratic in the way that the conservation team functions. It could be something that's legislative, or maybe something that's to do with appropriation even, or even just a something in the way we work together. And something that's reasonable and not like, well, the timber market needs to get extremely robust and maybe we're going to have, $1,000 pond values.
So one thing that we are just starting the discussions on, they've kind of been simmering, but we're really going to tackle in earnest in 2025. And Erin is going to be playing a leading role in this, is some clarification about our whole adaptive management framework and how do we create some of these habitat experiments that she mentioned earlier in a way that we ensure we have the resources to do the monitoring to assess whether these are appropriate ways to create Kirtland's warbler habitat. And because the agencies have an interagency memorandum of understanding that obligates them to create a particular number of acres annually for Kirtland's warbler, what do those acres have to look like? Do they have to be this opposing wave, or could they be something else? And creating a process through which we can evaluate alternative methods of creating habitat, and making sure those are acceptable, and then the relationship between different habitat creation methods and these obligations that are set forth in the Memorandum of Understanding is something that's really critical to the continuing partnership between the agencies and this investment in sustainable habitat creation.
Yeah, for sure. That's going to be really key moving forwards, especially in sort of the context of this whole economic quandary, right? That we kind of talked about earlier, and also in the sense of Kirtland's warbler is not the only rare species in this landscape. So there's a lot of interest in trying to shift to incorporate some of those other species into this management, at least to take that into consideration. And if that's feasible, how that's feasible, where is it feasible, those kinds of things. So, but at the same time, right, maintaining enough, standard habitat so that we maintain our bird numbers and our obligations, so that we don't see a reduction in the population. And the other thing I would say too, and we're already starting to address this, that interagency MOU that Steve just mentioned, that kind of it's between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Michigan DNR and the Forest Service. Again, that just sort of stipulates like our obligations, what each agency is committing to, and decision spaces and things like that. And it's a 5-year agreement. So we sort of renew it every 5 years. This year is the year that we are renewing it. And we've already been having some discussions about maybe some important changes for the next 5 years. And so historically, we have had a set number of habitat acres that each agency was obligated to maintain every single year. But as I'm sure all of stuff happens, right? There's a big difference between planning, habitat, and then operationalizing that. And stochastic things happen all the time that means that sometimes meeting those targets just isn't possible. But there's no in the current MOU, there's no recognition of that, right? It's you meet these habitat acres, and it's pretty black and white. So one of the things that we're talking about moving forwards, and Lindsay's sort of spearheading this, and so maybe she can talk about it a little bit too, is providing some kind of like 3-year average, or somehow allowing in the agency commitments for habitat creation, allowing for some years to be above target and other years to be below target, just sort of in recognition of these sort of operational difficulties that we all kind of encounter on an annual basis. So I would say that's we're working towards integrating that, but I'd say that's also going to be pretty key moving forwards too.
Phil, you can't really tell, but when I turned my head towards you with a gentle nod.
Yeah, I agree with everything Erin said. I think the habitat question is the big one now. How do we know how to create Kirtland warbler factories where we are actually pumping out lots of Kirtland's warbler with this opposing wave habitat. But we need to look at that habitat management more ecologically, and try to mimic what Mother Nature would do in a wildfire. And that's what we're really working on now. And like Erin had mentioned, we're doing a lot of experimental habitat work, and that includes a lot of monitoring to figure out exactly what sort of effects that we're having on it. And as a chair of the recovery team, I think the biggest challenge we see coming down the road is this: we need to remain nimble and being willing to change, because we don't know what the next challenge is going to be, and we found that out throughout the years. So it could be, we're not able to sell jack pine at all. And we may have to adjust the way we build habitat. Or we may have some new disease or insect outbreak that destroys a lot of Kirtland's warbler habitat. So we think about those things all the time. And so we just need to be ready to figure it out.
Scott, that just leaves you.
Yeah, I think the thing I'll just throw out there is that in order to get to delisting, it was really critical to have support to do key research. So like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funded habitat work. It funded some research related to cowbird control. Same with the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act, some of our migratory bird funding. So, I think one of the important lessons from Kirtland's warbler is that you can take a very, very challenging conservation problem and solve it. It's not an overnight thing, right? Some of these problems take years to figure out exactly how to recover species or how best to recover them. And just the importance of having, funding resources to be able to do the habitat work that's needed or do the research. And researchers were so key to helping refine management and figure out, like, could we wind down cowbird control and things like that. And just that's still going to be absolutely important as we continue down the road with the conservation team. I mean, that's just so important. So the support of that can't be overstated, sorry.
Thank you for that, Scott. I think we're running short on our time for our rest of our moderated panel discussion. Thank you all very much for that. It is very unique, I think, to have such a core trust between the group, to have something that has been going for almost 50 years, that people know each other, people know how to act in the group. A lot of that, how to treat each other and how to act, has actually been formalized by the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team so that it can continue in perpetuity. And it allows that sort of nimbleness, Phil. I mean, nimble and agencies don't tend to don't tend to go together. But you're kind of doing your best, and with a species that only likes a real tight window of a long-lived species of tree, like, well, they're not long-lived for trees, but compared to the birds, like it really requires that ongoing trust, that ongoing collaboration, that very, very active, regular communication, and sitting down with Erin and the planners and going through every single parcel of ownership to coordinate treatments and figuring out what works and what doesn't. And I think owning up to this is not working. Let's change it, and that's okay. Haven Barnhill has been monitoring the Q&A and the chats and has been sort of thematically grouping questions. Haven, if you would introduce a few of those questions for us.
Sure. Got some great discussion in the Q&A, super questions. Let's start with some specific habitat questions related to jack pine. What ideally for Kirtland warbler, how many trees per acre of jack pine provide good habitat? What's the goal there? Related to that, can you explain a little more about the harvest pattern, the checkerboard opposing wave pattern, and why do that, and what happens there? Kind of help us understand a little bit more what that's about. And the last related question to that is, have there been any thought to giving land a rest between harvest and planting, kind of extending the pre-forest condition that ecologically may naturally occur on some places, and what might that do? So those are kind of the specific jack pine bucket of questions.
Okay, I think I can take that, at least if I can remember them all. So as far as trees per acre, we're planting at a density of 1,452 trees per acre, which a typical forestry plantation, at least in northern Michigan, would be about 600 to 800 trees per acre. Correct me if I'm wrong, Lindsay. Um, and so this is fairly high density. But if you look at what wildfire produces, it can be upwards of 15,000 trees per acre for Kirtland's warbler habitat. But we found that planting in the opposing wave pattern, we're planting at a density of 1,452. But because we have those openings in there, we're only planting about 1,100 trees per acre when we're planting that habitat. And the reason those openings are within that plantation is that researchers have found that the birds tend to nest on the ground and adjacent to openings. And so while they may forage and carry out many of their other life habitat needs in the jack pines, the nesting actually occurs on the edges of those openings. And as far as giving those areas a chance to rest, that's an interesting concept. I think that kind of happens because while those areas are in heavy management, most of the time we also have we have wildfires that occur on a fairly regular basis within those areas, and that kind of resets those areas, I think. And so one of the big things that I promoted when I was a biologist with the Forest Service was that when we have a wildfire, we just leave it alone, because that's the type of habitat we're trying to mimic when we're developing Kirtland warbler habitat in an artificial way. So when we have these natural events occur and we get some natural regenerations with these just a really diverse restocking of trees with interspersed openings that are no way regular like you see in the opposing wave pattern, we've got something, I think, that mimics more closely what Mother Nature would have provided. And so, and that includes all the down wood and the snags and everything else within those habitats.
I would just tag on to that, Phil. We are definitely having an increased focus on what I refer to as special forest habitat, but those sand prairies, those pine barrens, those more open areas, and leaving them open in some instances, or more certainly than we used to. I would also tag that Mother Nature is much better at creating KW habitat than we are, and what we see in response to wildfire is significantly better than what we're producing with opposing wave, even though opposing wave is working very well and very consistently.
Thanks, Phil and Lindsay. Had a lot of questions about public perception. How has the community support for Kirtland warbler management changed since the initial fire escape some years back, and relative to timber harvest in some parts of the country? There's opposition to larger clear cuts or more intensive timber management. How does the community engage and react to some of that, and what kind of support and challenges do y'all see?
Erin or Steve, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, so it's definitely true that clear cuts are not everybody's favorite method of timber management. And as Phil mentioned before, he was talking about sort of large swaths of 200 to 500 acres being treated at a time, and so that's a lot. That's a large area that just sort of gets razed to the ground at one time. So all of us agencies that do land management, we definitely hear about that sometimes. It's like I said, it's not everybody's favorite. So I would say one this is also not the most populated part of Michigan either, right? So a lot of this, does take place in areas where there's not a lot of public interaction or public interface. So that helps a little bit. But we do just have to sort of just conduct a lot of public outreach. A lot of our, at least in the DNR, a lot of our habitat management happens in these local sort of forest units. And the forest units have asked us to provide them with talking points so that when they receive the angry phone calls, they know what to say and how to explain it and put it into this broader perspective of conservation. Because, people just, they just see what looks to them like destruction. They don't necessarily understand the necessity of it or the critical nature of it, why we're doing it. We also, within the DNR, we have some outreach folks that really try to engage with people, especially school kids. I think the Forest Service also does the same. There's like calendar contests and things like that. We also have a branch of the KW conservation team called the Kirtland's Warbler Alliance, which is sort of our outreach and advocacy group, and sort of at a larger scale, they really work to spread the word and kind of work with communities and even at a higher scale, legislators, et cetera, about the importance of this bird and this work.
Yeah, following up on what Erin talked about. So that's something that this recognition post Mac Lake fire, there was actually a consultant that was brought in to review some of the operations of the Kirtland's Warbler recovery team and understand how to repair the relationship with the local communities that had been really significantly damaged by that event. And really investing in community engagement and having like the human dimension subcommittee of the conservation team really be a focus of this work, recognizing that if you have regular opposition to the necessary habitat management, it can really start to put some sand in the gears of the whole operation, particularly as local people, their constituents, they vote, they know who their local representatives are in the state government. And so Erin mentioned the Kirtland's Warbler Alliance being a key member of the conservation team as a tiny nonprofit, but they have this very important role in public engagement and then also working with state legislators to make sure that they understand what the whole conservation program is about. There's a Kirtland's Warbler Festival that was started, I think, in the 1990s that celebrates Kirtland's warblers. So we do see kind of a varied response to Kirtland's warbler as a species and Kirtland's warbler management within the community. Sure, you do have those people that are very vocally concerned about things like clear cuts, but you also have Kirtland's warbler being turned into a really local symbol of the natural world for this region of Michigan. Through education of school kids and the general public and big celebrations like the Kirtland's Warbler Festival. I mean, there's a Kirtland's Warbler folk song. There you can go to some of these towns in northern Michigan and see Kirtland's Warbler sculptures and murals. So these communities really have, in a lot of ways, embraced Kirtland's Warbler as kind of a symbol of local pride.
I don't want to add sort of a downer on the end of that, Steve, because everything you just discussed is so wonderful. Just in case someone was asking about specifically the prescribed fire, we are still just barely dipping our toes back into the prescribed fire world. The Mac Lake fire really is like still in like the zeitgeist of mid-Michigan and Kirtland Warbler management. And so we're just getting back into that. And that, again, has involved a lot of public outreach and a lot of successes in prescribed fire in different but nearby areas or similar types. So the prescribed fire aspect of that and the community engagement, we're not quite back there yet. We're still working on that piece.
There were quite a few questions about the impacts of jackpine on other species, or the other species that y'all are monitoring that are benefiting from jackpine management, and conversely, is it having negative impacts on certain species that may be of conservation concern?
I think one of the big benefactors, for example, are large clear cuts. They stay open for, 2 to 5 years. And one of the species or number of species that benefit from those large open lands are upland sandpiper, um, eastern bluebird, and a number of woodpeckers. When we all started this program, our clear cuts did not leave a lot of woody structure within them, but as our team grew and we realized that we needed to start providing habitat for those other species, now most of our harvest areas don't include the harvest of dead wood, so that we have a lot of snags and downwood within those areas, which really has made a difference, I believe, in the number of bird species that use Kirtland's warbler habitat before the jack pines even come up. And so those areas are very, very rich in diversity of species. And we hope through our experimental habitat that we have a more diverse landscape than what we're producing with the opposing wave patterns, so that we provide those habitats even when the jackpine do come up, so that we have more large interspersed openings, for example, within those habitats that would also be conducive to other species using those areas.
Following up on what Phil mentioned, so right now there's quite a bit of discussion within the conservation team about sensitive plant species. So we have some colleagues at the Michigan Natural Features Inventory that have been out doing survey work in Kirtland's warbler management units, looking at some of the rarer plant species and how those might be affected positively or negatively by Kirtland's warbler management. So getting that information and getting consideration of those species incorporated into this management cycle is something that is pretty important. And I'll also say that some other species, things like pine marten, species that are quite significant to tribal communities in Michigan, is another thing that has more recently become a point of attention for the conservation team, as we seek to engage with tribal communities on their historic lands and think about species that they care about. They're interested in Kirtland's warbler, but they also care about things like snowshoe hare, which is a very culturally significant species for them. And Kirtland's warbler habitat areas are really excellent for snowshoe hare. So that's really a point of intersection between different conservation-focused communities that we can use to advance the management work moving forward.
Thanks, Scott. How important are private lands for warbler conservation in your area? And are y'all engaging the private land community? It seemed that on the partnership logo list, it seemed to be very heavily slanted towards public and nonprofit groups. Private landowners considered in this?
I can take that. I think we have considered private landowners, and but the bulk of Kirtland warbler, or the bulk of the habitat that's suitable for Kirtland's warbler, occurs on state and federal lands in the Lower Peninsula. So we do have some private lands where folks can manage for Kirtland's warbler, and on that list you saw a group called Huron Pines. It's a local conservation group that they work with private landowners who may want to produce Kirtland's warbler habitat on their lands. But like I said, I would say 90 to 95% of the jack pine is publicly owned. Anybody else have anything to add to that?
I would just say there's not a lot of like mid to large timber company ownership in the area, and because KW really need like a couple hundred acres for a target, it is harder for a lot of our small woodland owners to like directly be contributing to KW habitat. And a lot of times when they come with thoughts on how they can provide more toward the conservation of their local environment, there's higher priority things they could do or things that are better suited to a small woodland owner, if we're talking about them specifically.
Yeah, the exception to this, I completely agree with what Phil and Lindsay said, but the exception to this is actually in the fringes of the breeding range, in these areas where Kirtland's warbler is now expanding, places like central Wisconsin and southern Ontario, where there you have much less of the jack pine ecosystem area that is in public ownership, and you do have some opportunities to engage with private landowners. So that could be some of the larger timber holdings of private companies, but then also working with land trusts. So, for example, American Bird Conservancy has been funding habitat restoration work with a partnership with the Nature Conservancy in Wisconsin. And then also we've been providing some funding for a restoration project with a different land trust in Southern Ontario. In those areas, the situation is a little different in terms of the land ownership and who you need to engage to create Kirtland's habitat.
It's also very different in the Bahamas in their wintering range.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
So that is a really key component to the work you're doing in the wintering range.
Steve, you mentioned Ontario, and somebody else pointed out jack pine range extends way up into Canada, far beyond the warbler range. Is there potential for enhanced conservation, population expansion, or what effects may climate change have on the population?
Yeah, that's one of the big kind of head scratchers about Kirtland's warbler is we think about it being so tightly associated with jack pine, but when you look at the range of jack pine as a species, it's huge compared to the range of Kirtland's warbler. So at least my understanding, and Phil can probably he can jump in and tell me if I'm wrong, is that the reason that we see Kirtland's warbler being so small in terms of its range is that although jack pine does occur across this much broader area of the continent, the unique conditions in which jack pine is the dominant species, where you have a near monoculture of jack pine in the forest, that tends to be associated with particular soil types that you find more often in the Great Lakes Basin because of the history of glaciation. So you don't find thousands and thousands of near uniform acres of jack pine if you go into somewhere like northern Saskatchewan or something like that. It's just a different landscape. However, there are some indications that Kirtland's warbler may be able to find some areas of suitable habitat for a little further north than what we normally associate with Kirtland's warbler, with the historic range. There are breeding season records of birds into central Ontario, north of places like Algonquin Park, and also in Algonquin Park, where there's talk of habitat restoration for Kirtland's warbler. There's also a really interesting case right now with just in the last 2 years, a regenerating jack pine forest on the Canadian Shield on the north side of Lake Huron now has breeding Kirtland's warblers in an area where the substrate there is primarily rock. It's not sand like we have in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan. And the Kirtlands have found it and started to use it. And so the bird continues to find pockets of habitat in places where we thought maybe they couldn't find it if it were there, and teach us about how its habitat requirements and its flexibility may be a little bit broader than what we inferred from when the population was so tiny, less than 400 birds, and they were really focused on the ideal habitat. That's the only place that they were. And now we're seeing there's a little bit more of wiggle room there than what we suspected.
So, Steve, that's a nice bookend to one of Phil's first thoughts, which was that the birds show up where you don't expect them and they don't show up where you do expect them. With that said, we are at the top of our, I guess, the bottom of the hour here and need to start wrapping things up. Thank you very much to everyone on our panel. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. As a reminder to everyone, this is approved for CEU credit for both Society of American Foresters and the Wildlife Society. The next webinar will be February 18th, again at noon Eastern, and it will be on the regeneration and reforestation for wildlife, sustaining forests in changing environmental conditions. Questions that were not answered, we will do our best to go through and provide some written answers to those in the next. I don't want to give some sort of short timeline and pretend that we're going to magically turn these around, but the next couple of weeks we will do our best to respond to any of those questions that weren't answered as we are able to. Recordings of this webinar will be available both on the Amanda Mahaffey has linked this in the chat, both on the Fish and Wildlife Service series page and on a page hosted by NIAX. Gwen, any other closeout?
No, that sounded great. Thank you for our entire panelists. Thank you, Lindsay, for moderating. You did a great job. And as always, behind the scenes, thanks you, Amanda, for all of your assistance. You were great. All right. See you guys in February.